Before I begin the presentation, I'd like to take a moment to thank the many people who have helped me during this creative process. First, thank you Sam Louder and the rest of the GMEA staff for allowing me the opportunity to present today. I have always wanted the opportunity to speak on this topic. GMEA has always inspired me with wonderful sessions, and I am honored to be among the presenters for this year. Second, I would like to thank the Lassiter Concert Hall and specifically Roger Christian for allowing me to film in their beautiful hall. Third, Annie Cook, my lovely mom, who took time out of her day to help me make the recordings for this session. And lastly, to all my music educator colleagues, thank you for your unending encouragement, advice, and words of wisdom. I only hope to pay forward what you have given me. And of course, thank you to all of you who are tuning in today. So let's go ahead and get started. This is going to be a lot of information in a very short amount of time, and it's going to be a bit like drinking through a fire hose. However, I'm more than happy to share the video with you after the session. I've built in about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the session for those of you with specific questions, and I will also give you my personal email in case you guys have any questions further down the road. The first thing we'll talk about today is bow tension. And one thing that's really important is that you actually have a curve to the bow, regardless if it's tight or not. This allows the bow itself to flex, allowing you to make a bigger sound and be more flexible with your sound. So what you want to be able to do is take your bow and put it in the middle of your string and still be able to push down and get the stick to touch the string itself. If you can't get it to touch, or if it takes a lot of effort, that means the bow is actually too tight, meaning you're not going to be able to make as good of a sound, and it's also just not very good for the bow itself. Next, we'll talk about rosin, which is something that I think most people feel very comfortable doing, but a lot of people still do wrong. So the first thing I'll have you notice is the ferrule, which is a small metal piece where your ring finger comes down, which we'll talk about in bow holds later. But that little piece is responsible for probably 90% of rosins being destroyed. So what I strongly suggest is covering that with your thumb, doing some short strokes down at the end, short strokes at the other end, and a couple long strokes. And you only need to do this every 2 to 3 days if you're a student level musician. Posture is another thing that I see a lot of students doing wrong. And one of the biggest issues they do is they either slouch or they actually poke out their chest because they're trying to have such a straight back. And it's really important to note that your back is intentionally designed so that it has an S shape to it. And specifically, we'll be looking at the thoracic section. And when you tell students to push their chest out, what you're doing is you're having them straighten out their spine, which can cause quite a few issues in your middle back. And the other issue is if they slouch, they will end up with neck pain as well as lower back pain. So what we really want to look like is on the right side of that picture there, where you still have a little bit of a curve, but you still have flexibility in your spine, allowing you to move left and right, up and down, and still have square shoulders whenever you're playing. One contributing factor to poor posture is not having the end pin set up in the right position. So the first thing I'll have a new student do is set up their cello without their end pin out. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of cupping the cello with my legs, and I'm looking for a couple points of contact. One is going to be right at the lower C bout on the right side. I want that to not be jabbing me in the leg. I want that to go up and over my leg, following the shape of my leg, as you can see in the picture here. Once I'm in that position, I will then lower the end pin and have them move their legs back. From that position, I can then talk about the 4 points of contact, which is one sitting on the chest or sternum. We have those 2 points on the right and left leg, and of course the end pin touching the floor. So at no point is my hand holding up the instrument. The last check I'll do is I'll have them sit in their proper posture, cross their hands, and see if their palms can come down on top of the bridge. If their hands don't quite reach the bridge, that means their end pin probably needs to come out just a little bit more. And conversely, if their hands can easily go past the bridge, that means their end pin is too high. But this is still a good check and can give you a good indication as to whether they're sitting in the right spot. If you're not sure, again, go back to the 4 points of contact and just make sure that the C bouts are sitting on top of their legs and not jabbing them in the legs. Keep in mind that this is a generality. In middle school, a lot of students are kind of awkwardly shaped, and they will have very short arms or short torsos. So this may be more apt to a high school level, or at least once a student is fully grown. The left hand, I think, is actually one of the easiest things to get correct if you don't learn it wrong. And it's incredibly hard to unteach yourself how to play with bad posture and bad technique with the left hand. So I'll often tell students one of two ways to bring down the string. And one is to use your thumb and to pinch the string down, which is what a lot of students do, versus the correct way, which is to use the weight of your arm to bring down the string instead, as you'll see in the following video. So you'll notice in this clip that my thumb was actually completely detached from the instrument. So one thing that tends to help students is to remind them that they have a 15-pound arm attached to their left hand that they can use to easily pull down the string, as opposed to using the tiny muscle in their thumb to pinch down the string instead, which can make it virtually impossible to do a correct vibrato and also just makes it really hard to move around the instrument. You can ask most kids of any age, regardless of grade level, if they have ever felt like their hand is on fire at the end of a concert, and 90% of them will answer yes. And the reason for that is generally because of the muscle that is just underneath your thumb. This is something you can all do, where if you follow along with the clip, where if you pinch your thumb together and feel the muscle underneath your thumb, it's going to be very taut and hard. And instead, if you put your thumb across your palm and drape your fingers on top of it, the muscle underneath will be very soft. And this in general is the goal, because anytime you have tension, that's going to cause pain over time. There are 3 general rules for the left hand as to keeping good posture and technique. One is going to be to always have round fingers. And you'll see this a couple times throughout the video where I say always for now. And this is when you're first learning, we always do it this way. And eventually we learn how to break the rules. So in the beginning, it seems obvious, but always have round fingers. Most likely kids will be playing more on the pad of their finger as opposed to playing on the tip. And we definitely want them to stay on the tip of their finger if possible. The second rule is that the pinky never plays by itself. And this has to do with anatomical reasons as well as technical reasons, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we get to vibrato. But initially, the first thing I'll have students do is I'll have them hold up their left hand and bend their first finger, bend their second finger, bend their third finger. And then right before they bend their fourth finger, I tell them to only bend it without bending the ring finger. And all the kids always freak out because they can't actually do it. And then you ask the question, why? The answer has to do with the anatomy of your hand. And as you can see in this diagram, the pinky tendon is actually attached to where the ring finger tendon comes down. So while the ring finger can move by itself all the time, the pinky often needs help. So I will always ask the students, okay, if I were to give Olympic medals to my fingers, which one's going to get the gold medal for being the strongest? And usually they'll say the index finger, but the correct answer is your middle finger. It is the longest, it's the strongest. Silver medal goes to your index finger, and bronze goes to your ring finger. And pinky gets the participation award. It always needs help, and the way we get that help is to use our third finger in conjunction with our pinky all the time, for now. A cool way of demonstrating the third rule, which is to always hang from the instrument with your left hand, is to watch this awesome gibbon swinging through the trees.
Whoa.
While it's a little hard to see in this video, what I want you to notice is that while the monkey is flying around, it is not grabbing onto the branch with its thumb and its fingers. Instead, it's draping its fingers over the branch that it's going to and using its own weight to keep itself onto the branch. And the way this is analogous is going back to the tense thumb that we looked at just a moment ago, where it could have reached its thumb all the way around and gripped it. And instead, it's just going to be hanging off of the branch itself. And for us, we're just going to be hanging off of the cello. So to wrap this up into a nice little bow, make sure that you're hanging off the instrument, pulling down on the strings and not pinching up with your thumb. As a quick aside, there is a pretty cool but also somewhat disturbing thing that happens within our arm whenever we're moving our fingers. And I think it's really important for the kids to know what's happening inside of their arms. And this further just highlights why we want to keep our fingers down and round all the time instead of picking them up, because it will cause things like tendonitis or carpal tunnel further down the road because of what we see inside of our arms, like this. One of my favorite exercises to do with my students whenever we're working on left hand and keeping everything round is to do what I call the hanging scale exercise. So all I'm doing is I'm going up a scale. It can be 1 octave, 2 octave, depending on their skill level, and trying to play the entire scale without using their thumb at all, which is virtually impossible if they aren't actually hanging off the side of the instrument. And just as a quick recap, I'm going to have round fingers, my thumb is not touching the cello, and I'm using the weight of my arm to bring down the string. I would be lying if I said this was easy, especially for beginning students. However, if they're successfully able to get through it, they will be much, much better prepared for more advanced technique later on. Once they get a hang of the hanging scale exercise, no pun intended, we then move on to what I call tickling the cello, which is just kind of a funny name, but for a surprisingly difficult exercise. As I said, this exercise can be quite difficult. However, once kids figure out the motions of it, it'll just become second nature and they'll be better set for the advanced technique later on. The bow hold is obviously incredibly important. I think it's very easy to start, but students tend to develop some really bad habits really quickly, and then it's really hard to, again, unlearn those type of things. So the first thing I have a student do is I will have them make a fist with their right hand and then relax their hand. This is the natural state for the bow. And they're going to line up their ring finger over that ferrule, that little piece right by the frog, so that the fingertip is just overhanging that side. The second finger will be touching the bow hair. It's completely fine. And most importantly, we have a straight line from our knuckle going all the way back to our elbow. We're going to talk about straight lines and their importance in cello playing a little bit later in the video. On the back side of the bow hold, you'll see my thumb is bent and round, and it's sitting more on the outside of the stick. I don't let it go inside of the stick. That's super important and something that a lot of students either just aren't taught correctly, or they figure out on their own that, oh, if I just stick my thumb right into the middle, it's more comfortable. However, you end up not being able to make flexible bow changes, and you end up playing with a very stiff sound. And moreover, just in terms of anatomy, you can cause a lot of tension in that muscle underneath your thumb. So here I just give you another little preview of a different angle. So I'm relaxing my hand, I'm aiming my ring finger over the ferrule, my second finger is touching the bow hair, which is totally fine. On the back you should be able to see my thumb bending and hitting the outside of the stick, and on top I have a straight wrist from my knuckle all the way back to my elbow. As teachers, we tend to concentrate mostly on the left hand because that's what's most obviously out of tune and honestly the easiest to fix. You just tell somebody play a high 2. But it's the right hand that makes things sound musical, and it gives us our dynamics. It gives us all those things that we tend to get dinged on at LGPE. So we'll be talking about bow flexibility, which is the process of not just using your shoulder or your elbow, but your entire arm down the length all the way down to the fingertips in order to give you a more supple sound, to work on bow changes, and to make everything a little bit more smooth. So here you'll notice I'm going to be raising from my shoulder and my elbow down to my wrist, and then furthering that along to my first knuckles all the way down to my fingertips. The idea being that I'm making a smooth motion all the way from my shoulder down to my fingers. So if we take apart those a little bit slower, we start with our shoulder, and this is what we work on mainly in 6th grade. We put a bow into a student's hand, we put it on the instrument, and they saw back and forth. And that's what tends to give those 6th graders their lovely sound, is just the sawing motion back and forth. And hopefully by the end of 6th grade into 7th grade, we've started working on the forearm. Once we're able to open up that hinge, they're able to use much more of the bow. However, again, they don't have great sound, generally because they're moving around on their contact point a lot, which we end up needing our wrist for. So by the end of middle school, they're hopefully opening up their wrist, allowing them to maintain a straight line on their contact point. And then as we get into high school, we are now moving our knuckles all the way down to our fingertips to make the smoothest possible bow transitions that we can. An exercise I use to work on the first 3 joints, which is the shoulder, wrist, and elbow, is called the rowboat exercise. I'll have students grab the bow in both hands and work on getting flexibility between all 3 of those sections. So raising from the shoulders, raising the elbow, and going all the way down to the wrist. You'll notice in this position I can't actually move my knuckles and fingers, but that's honestly okay at this point. To work on the latter 2 sections, the knuckle and the finger joints, I use what's called the squid hand exercise, which kind of, as the name implies, ends up looking a bit like a squid. The fingers are all moving independently, including the thumb, in order for me to move the bow back and forth in a straight line smoothly. Basically, I'm trying to make all of my successive joints from my shoulder down to my fingertips work as little shock absorbers, so that by the time I'm playing my full bow and I get to the tip for a bow transition, I've used all of my joints all the way down to the tiniest ones to make it as smooth as possible. One more thing that can help with keeping a really smooth sound is our string crossings, which sometimes tend to get a little bit ignored. We talk a lot about the bow angles depending on the string, but we don't talk a lot about how to get from one string to another smoothly. So here you're going to see an exercise called the growing C major scale. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be playing a 2-octave C major scale. And again, you can level this for whichever ensemble you're going to be working with. And I'm going to play in one bow from my bottom C all the way to my top C. And the idea is that I shouldn't be able to tell exactly when you change strings because you're so smooth from one string to the next. So in this clip, what I want you to look at is the tip of my bow or the frog of my bow. And you'll see in the first clip that it's very jumpy, getting from one string to the next. And then the second string, I smooth everything out and make it one even arc going up to my A string all the way back to my C. As I mentioned with talking with the right hand, it's doubly important that you have a straight arm with your left hand as well. It's going to be important for extensions, but also just to make sure that we aren't tense in our hand. As you can see, it doesn't matter which position I'm actually in, whether it's first position or up by the fingerboard, I will have a straight arm the entire time. And now to one of my favorite topics, which is extensions. And as I mentioned before, straight arms are your friend for extensions. You never want to break your wrist for an extension. It's going to put an enormous amount of strain on the top of your wrist or underneath, depending on which way you break it. Going back to what we talked about a little bit earlier with the pinky and the ring finger being attached, I want to make sure that I'm only putting an extension between my first 2 fingers. There's too much happening in the middle of your hand for 2 and 3 to separate, and 3 and 4 should never be separated because of the anatomy of your hand, and you can cause serious injuries if you repeatedly do it over and over incorrectly. There are 2 different types of extensions. There is a forward extension and a backwards extension. And one thing I really want to highlight is the fact that you really don't separate your 2 fingers, much in the same way where you would hold up a peace sign. Instead, what we're doing is we're curling our first finger and extending our second finger, or vice versa. So as you can see in this clip, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my elbow back, allowing me to curl my first finger, and I'm going to extend my second finger forward. This is called a forward extension, where I am reaching my second finger forward, allowing me to bypass where my second finger would normally go, which in turn allows my fourth finger to go a half step higher than I would normally be able to place it. In this case, I'm on the D string, so instead of reaching to a fourth finger G, I'm now on a fourth finger G sharp. Note that my arm is completely straight the entire time. I'm never breaking my wrist, and as you'll see in a video here in just a second, you'll see that my thumb is very relaxed and actually moving around behind me so that I'm not clenching the instrument. So here we get a nice side view of a forward extension. And the first thing I want you to notice is the elbow coming back, allowing me to create a nice straight line from my elbow all the way back to my second finger. And the second thing is my thumb, which is tracking along behind my second finger. So generally it's going to be behind first finger, maybe second finger. Once I do a big extension, I need to make sure my thumb slides behind it, allowing my hand to come back to my normal elbow resting position, therefore reaching up to my fourth finger. The backwards extension will work in the exact opposite way. So instead of bringing my elbow back, I'm going to bring my elbow down, allowing me to reach my first finger back, again creating a straight line, hopefully from my first finger all the way down to my elbow. Here we get a view of a backwards extension. And like I said, this is somewhat rare, but it is very important, especially in upper level music, that you're lowering that elbow, creating that straight line, and I'm really playing on the side of my first finger. Note in this extension that I really haven't moved my thumb, unlike the forward extension, because I'm not actually moving my hand. A forward extension is pretty close to a shift. We could go ahead and call it just like a mini shift, versus a backwards extension, which isn't going to do that. Lastly, for extensions, we have a somewhat hidden technique. It's not one that you're ever going to see in middle school and only in the upper reaches of high school. But again, in case we ever see them, I want to make sure that we do them correct way. And this is called a flare. And there are different names for this. That's just what I use in my studio. But this is a way for you to do an octave or an extension that's really big without the time to do one of the full extensions, either a backwards or forward extension. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to straight up release my thumb, keeping a straight arm, so I'm taking my elbow out as far as it can go in a straight line, allowing me to reach up with my pinky and place it up at the area that I need it to go. Again, this is a very advanced technique. You're not going to see this in a lot of music, but whenever you have pieces that have a lot of octave jumps, this is super useful so that you don't have to shift over and over again or use your thumb. One more thing to note is that I've said up until now that you always have your third and fourth finger together. However, this is one of those few techniques where you're only going to be placing your pinky. This is why we want the elbow to come out so that it's able to support the weight of your pinky without causing too much strain. This next clip is me just highlighting what a bad extension looks like, and it's something I'm sure we have all seen if we've ever seen students clenching while trying to do an extension. One, this just looks painful, and it's honestly not super comfortable to play in, but I've got my thumb round on the back instead of being bent, more like if I'm grabbing a Coke can, and I'm really spreading my fingers out instead of curling that first finger and keeping two straight, like I talked about in my previous video. This next segment, we'll be talking about vibrato, which is something that plagues a lot of high schoolers in getting their full attention and grasp of the material. So I use a very crude but very effective analogy called granny on a motorcycle, which is to get you to be thinking about using the back of your bicep. The first exercise we talk about is the robot arms, which is a silly exercise. I do it with my high schoolers as well. It always makes everybody kind of crack up whenever you're doing it. But all you have to do is raise up, and I use both of my arms just to highlight the effect of it. But you raise up both arms. Again, we want to feel the back of the bicep, and we're going to wave our arms up and down. And if you try that at your computer, you should be able to feel that in the back of your arm as well. Next up is the karate chop, which is highlighting a different portion of your arm that is still vital to using vibrato. So one is the back of the arm and the other is the forearm moving up and down. So I will often have them just karate chop up and down the side of their instrument, at which point I will then begin independent finger exercises, which is sometimes quite difficult whenever they're first starting with vibrato. So we're doing a karate chop motion and then moving our fingers independently at the same time. One thing to note is, as you can see in the freeze frame, whenever I put my fourth finger down, my third finger is always coming down with it during vibrato. That is the only finger that it's not going to be played by itself, though you can do vibrato with second and third finger together. Primarily it's going to be separate. Once we've got those exercises feeling pretty comfortable, we will then combine them by sliding your finger up and down on the string, eventually getting narrower and narrower. This would take a number of days working with the students to get them to this point, but this is just kind of fast tracking you through the motions. As you get narrower and narrower, I would eventually say that I drop, for instance, a drop of super glue or something onto the string so that the arm is still going in the same motion, but your finger is stuck on the string. And that is what's causing the oscillating patterns up and down for your vibrato. Here we have a nice side view of vibrato happening, and as I mentioned before, you always want to be on the tips of your fingers until we start getting a nice comfortable vibrato, at which point you will move a little closer towards the middle of the pad of your finger. We don't want the finger to collapse backwards, but we need more of the pad to move up and down to help facilitate a nice vibrato. I'm sure you're tired of hearing about the straight arms, but even during vibrato, we want to have a straight arm. And here we get to see a cool side view of vibrato happening. And you'll see that I will actually slow it down. And if you want to, with your cursor, put your cursor over my elbow, and you'll see that the elbow joint isn't actually moving. It is sitting in one spot while my forearm is moving forward and the back of my arm is moving in conjunction with my forearm to make one steady motion. The other thing you might notice is that my arm angle is changing depending on which string I'm using. This is, again, is a very advanced technique that I wouldn't even bother mentioning to the students until at least they're in chamber. But for those of you that are interested in it, in general, your first finger is going to have an elbow pointing a little towards the back, second and third finger more in the middle, and then fourth finger you have your elbow dropping, because we always want to have a lot of weight coming down for our pinky to help support it because it's so weak. And what I was perhaps most excited to film in this entire series was a slow motion side view of the vibrato so that you can actually see what's happening to the tips of my fingers as I'm doing that vibrato motion. So the first thing I want you to notice is a loose thumb. I'm not squeezing with my thumb. Vibrato will not work, and you'll end up with what we call the bumblebee vibrato, which is just very fast and twangy. Instead, we want it to be nice and round and smooth, and you'll see that the tip of my finger is the only thing that's oscillating back and forth, while my arm is just moving up and down. And while you can't see it in this video, you should be feeling the back of your bicep moving up and down in conjunction with your forearm. And now we have an exercise to work on your vibrato called the 1, 2, 3, 4 exercise. And what you'll see as we look through the video is I'm going to be vibratoing with my first finger and then adding my second finger before subtracting my first finger. So it's always an additive process. So in the beginning, you always have two fingers vibrating at the same time before you let one go. And the whole purpose of this is that your arm never stops moving. Vibrato really comes from the arms. A lot of students will be thinking about their fingers moving up and down, but really as long as the arm is moving consistently, that'll give us a consistent vibrato with your fingers. This is one of those exercises that looks very simple and even sounds simple as I say it until the students actually try it, at which point they will most likely pause in between every single finger. So the idea is that it's one continuous motion all the way up to their pinky and back down. Thumb position is of course very useful and necessary, especially in the higher classes. However, before I can talk about the nuances of thumb position, we have to talk about how to even get up to thumb position, because it's not often that we are starting in thumb position. So we're going to look at Mr. Yo-Yo Ma, and here you will see that we have what I call the hump, which is the side of the cello that you have to get up and over before you can get to thumb position. Life would be so much easier if we didn't have this portion of the instrument blocking us, but here we are. So the first thing I would do when practicing thumb position is, of course, bringing up the thumb around the backside of the instrument. So I'm moving my arm up and down, I'm keeping that nice straight arm, and right before I hit the block, I'm bringing up my thumb around to the side and up on top of the instrument. And it's not possible to do this if you are clenching with your thumb. Here's another view just to give you a different idea of what you should be looking for. Again, bringing up the thumb, my fingers are nice and curled, and my arm is staying straight. And finally, a side view in slightly slow motion. And here I want you to notice, yes, my thumb is coming up, but my arm is really scraping the side of that hump, the side of the cello, to stay as close to the cello as I can without resting my arm on it. Once you're up and over the hump, we then have to prepare our left hand physically for the action of thumb position, and we use what are called thumb grooves. The first thing I'm going to do in preparation for thumb position is I'm going to form my hand into a fist and line up my thumb directly in line with my other fingers. From that point, I'm going to go to my cello, go to normal thumb position in that fist, and using the weight of my arm, push down on the string and slide up and down. This is the only thing I tell my students that is actually painful, but your hand is incredibly quick at healing, and over the course of a couple days, you'll develop a callus. And you will permanently have these two grooves in your thumb if you play all the time. And the A string is lining up about halfway up the thumbnail. And the D string lines up wherever it's going to line up because all of our hands are a little bit different. So there are a couple things to notice in this example. One is that the space between my first and second finger is the same exact space between my thumb and my first finger. Having the kids use their eyes and just look for that is very helpful. Also notice the pinky is just sticking up in the air. It is too short to play in thumb position for now. This is just another angle for you to see the spacing between my first and second finger being the same as the space between my thumb and first finger, and also my pinky is just hanging off to the side. I'm going to emphasize here that the vibrato in thumb position is the exact same vibrato that you see in any other position on your instrument. Angle of attack slightly changes, but it's still driven solely from the arm. I'm using the weight of my arm to bring down my fingers, and I'm making sure my arm is moving continuously. There's no rotation happening with anything other than a fingertip oscillating up and down to create the vibrato. I've given you guys a little checklist here of things to think about when you're in thumb position. So one, of course, is that the thumb should be straight across the A and D grooves. The fingernails are pointing towards the bridge, much like a violin or viola player would. The arm stays straight, even in thumb position. I'm sure you guys are tired of me of saying, keep your arm straight. The space between your thumb and 1 is the same as the space between 1 and 2, again, for now, but for your major scales and the majority of what you're going to be playing in high schools, this is primarily true. And using the weight of your arm to bring down the thumb. One last note about thumb position is your harmonic that your thumb is sitting on can sound in tune even if your thumb isn't actually on there. So what we can do is an exercise called trampoline-ing, where you'll put your thumb straight across both strings in your good hand position and push down. And if the pitch doesn't change, that means you're in tune. But if it bends up or it bends down, that means you're actually above or below the harmonic. Being able to stay in one bow lane is only possible if you're able to pull in a perfectly straight line. And later we're going to talk about how to adjust those lines so that we can move up and down at will. As I've made my way out to the very tip of my bow, as I've worked my way out, I'm doing what's called pronating my hand, which is turning my hand much in the same way you would turn a doorknob. But you'll see that all of that weight is going into my first finger. There's a little bit of weight in my second finger, and then third and fourth finger are either completely released or at least don't have any weight left into the fingers. This is pretty much the first time you'll have heard me say that we are going to break our straight line. I am opening up my wrist and my palm is now facing away from me. The very first thing we need to be able to do is, of course, pull in a very straight line. So I would have the students practice going from down bow to up bow, making a perfectly straight line while staring at their contact point. This next exercise that I call drifting is much harder, but is equally as important, especially as we get to the upper level of playing, in that you should be able to freely adjust which bow lane you're in. And the way we do that is we follow the tip of our bow. So whenever we're on a down bow, if the tip goes down, the rest of the bow will also go down, and vice versa. Here I do the same exercise, but starting on an up bow. When I start on an up bow, I'm then following where my frog is. So if the frog goes up, the rest of the bow will go up, and vice versa. And here we'll just see a closer view of a down bow bow drift as well as an up bow bow drift. You might be wondering why I've waited so long in this video to do a tuning section, and it's really because I think it's vital that you have a good tone while you're tuning, and if we don't know how to make a good tone, we're not going to have a consistent tuning pitch. There are two different ways to tune using our instrument besides using a tuning app. The first is using harmonic tuning, which is probably the easiest, and two is using fifths, which is what you'll primarily see professionals using, but they really do a mixture of both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. So to find our fifths, just stick your thumb on the back like we would be in fourth position. You're going to use your ring finger and not your pinky to reach up to the halfway point harmonic, and then you'll come back right above where your thumb is to find your first finger harmonic on the next string over. Being on an instrument that was even that out of tune, the entire tuning process only took me about 40 seconds. So if you are able to successfully teach that to your students, it will drastically decrease the amount of time you have to spend tuning in a classroom. Tuning in fifths is a fair bit harder, especially for newer players. What they're going to be listening for is the vibrations between the two strings to line up for a perfect fifth. Here I've already tuned my A so that it's in tune, as we would be tuning to an oboe or to a tuning app or something of the sort, and then going down string by string. Once my D string is in tune, I can then double stop over to my G string, etc. Here you can see me slightly pressing at the top of each string while I'm tuning. So if my A string is in tune and I double stop over to my D string and D sounds out of tune, if I raise the pitch slightly of the D string and it gets better, that tells me that the D needs to go higher. If I raise the pitch and it gets worse, that tells me that I need to then lower that string. There's a lot of physics that go into sympathetic vibrations. I honestly wouldn't even bother explaining too much of it to my kids. as long as they know that if you play a note that corresponds with one of your open strings, that note will then vibrate a lot longer. And it actually goes a lot further than that, in that there's an overtone series, and most notes on your instrument will make other notes ring due to harmonic series. They can use this information whenever they're playing scales or even just a piece to check what I call anchor points. So that's one of those open string notes, just to make sure that they're really locked in. I'll play a scale here in a moment where you'll see me using those anchor points to check intonation. Here's just a quick visual so that you can see my open C vibrating even though I'm not actually touching it. I just happen to be in tune, which is causing it to vibrate. Unlike violin and viola, there is one standard fingering for all of your major scales. There's a few exceptions, for instance like C major, where you get to start on an open C, or G major, but for the most part the pattern is extension, extension, no extension, no extension, and a 3. So for the first octave you were doing an extension and then moving back, doing an extension, and then shifting. Then you're done with your extensions. You do no extension, no extension. And for the first time in your scale, at the top of your second octave, you'll play your third finger. And you'll see that in the following clip, and you will also see me checking with my anchor points to make sure my intonation is correct. The third octave also has a standard fingering, which is 1, 2, shift, 1, 2, shift, 1, 2, 3. And it's the same going up as it is coming down. If you would like a more in-depth look at the scale patterns for the cello, please check out my school's YouTube account, and you can see me demonstrating all 12 major scales with the correct fingerings at a slow tempo for students to be able to play with them. The last demonstration I will do for you guys is what I call the Typewriter fingers, which are part of a larger thing called the Kosman exercises, which are free on IMSLP. And again, I'd be happy to email you and let you know more information on those. But the Typewriter fingers is where I'm really slamming my fingers down to the point that I could play a scale or play a piece without using my bow and still tell which pitches that I'm playing. If you don't come down with enough force, you end up kind of smearing the note around, as you will hear in this demonstration, and it just doesn't sound very clean, and you will end up losing a lot of clarity in your tone. The last thing I will do for you all today is I will play a short piece by Ennio Morricone called Playing Love, and I've given you 3 different video examples so that you can see my right hand, my left hand, and a front profile in the proper posture. The piece goes from first position all the way up to high thumb position, and hopefully it will give you an idea of what proper posture and technique looks like. Thank you all so much for sticking around to the end of the video. I had a lot of fun making it, and hopefully you guys learned something from it as well. Feel free to stick around and ask me any questions that you may have from either the video or something that might have been left out. If not, I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions here at GMEA.